In the autumn of 1878, a farmer's plow blade struck something hard while he was working a dry creek bed in western Arkansas. Assuming it was a root, he kept digging. What he uncovered was a rifle, a Sharps carbine, military issue. Its stock was blackened by old fire, its barrel warped from heat, and it was wrapped inside the rotting remains of a cotton sack. Stitched along the inner seam, in rust-colored thread, were 11 names. 9 of these had already appeared on federal death warrants, filed at the courthouse in Fort Smith, just across the state line. The other 2 had vanished from every census, tax roll, and church ledger in the Indian Territory, as if the earth had swallowed them without a sound. That same afternoon, the farmer brought the rifle and the sack to the federal marshal's desk in town. Within 48 hours, the rifle was gone. The farmer's written statement was gone. And the name at the very bottom of the cotton sack, underlined 3 times in that same rust-colored thread, was gone with them. For nearly a century, no serious historian would admit that name could belong to a woman. When the truth finally emerged, buried in the private letters of a court clerk and uncovered by a descendant in 1962, it brought with it a detail so disturbing that the Arkansas Historical Society, after 2 closed-door meetings and a formal vote, decided against publishing it. The file remains sealed to this day. Before we continue with the story of the woman the Choctaw roads came to call Nani, meaning Sparrow, the only bounty hunter on the American frontier, whose very name made outlaws bury their weapons in the dirt and flee to the Mexican border. Do me a small favor, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss any of these forgotten stories. And in the comments, tell me what state, country, or city you're listening from right now. I'm always amazed at how far these stories travel, and I read every single comment to grasp what this woman did and why the records of her deeds are so deliberately fragmented. You first have to understand the world she operated in, the land between the Arkansas River and the Red River in the years after the Civil War was not a state in any meaningful legal sense. It was not America. It was the Indian Territory, a vast stretch of unorganized country across what is now eastern Oklahoma, set aside by treaty for the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole nations following the forced removals of the 1830s. Because it was not a state, state law did not reach it. Tribal courts held jurisdiction only over their own citizens. Any person who was neither a tribal member nor a federal soldier could commit murder in broad daylight on a creek road at noon and walk away untouched by any sheriff. Every outlaw, deserter, horse thief, counterfeiter, bigamist, arsonist, and runaway killer east of the Rocky Mountains knew this. They had known it since the war ended by 1870. The territory had become the largest sanctuary for fugitives on the North American continent, a region of roughly 70,000 square miles, with a white criminal population estimated by the Federal Marshal's Office at more than 2,000 men. The only law that followed these men in was the United States Marshal Service, riding out of the federal court at Fort Smith, Arkansas, under a hanging judge named Isaac Parker. Over his 21-year career on the bench, Parker would sign the execution warrants of 79 men and preside over the trials of more than 13,000 cases. To enforce Parker's warrants across the territory, the marshals relied on a strange class of contracted riders called deputy marshals, about 200 of them at any given time. Beneath them was a rougher class still freelance bounty hunters, paid per living body delivered to the Fort Smith jail, and per corpse delivered with verifiable identification matching the warrant. The pay was $2 for an arrest, plus 10 cents a mile, plus a share of whatever reward a fugitive's specific warrant happened to carry. Most bounty hunters in the territory were ex-Confederate cavalrymen down on their luck, Chickasaw freedmen who knew the backcountry, Cherokee veterans of the Union Indian Home Guard, still young enough to ride hard, or former outlaws who had cut deals with Parker's court to hunt their old partners for money. The average bounty hunter in that period lasted about 4 seasons before being killed or crippled. Almost none survived a full decade, and almost every single one was a man. The woman the Choctaw Roads came to call Nani did not fit a single one of those categories. She had been born into slavery in the Mississippi bottomlands around the year 1840. She had escaped in the autumn of 1864, while Sherman's army was cutting through Georgia, 600 miles to the east. She had crossed the Mississippi River on a stolen flatboat in the winter of her freedom. And by the spring of 1869, she was living alone in a one-room cabin on the border between the Choctaw Nation and the state of Arkansas, keeping a Sharps carbine across her knees, a pair of Remington Army revolvers in a flour sack beside her bed, and a leather cord around her neck strung with 7 small bone beads. How she got from a cotton field in Yazoo County to that cabin on that border, and what she did once she arrived, is the question this story attempts to answer. It is not a pleasant question, and the answer, as far as the records we still have allow us to reconstruct it, is not a pleasant answer. Her name on the Carrick plantation ledger was Hester. No surname was recorded, because none of the Carrick people were given surnames in the plantation books. The plantation lay along a stretch of Yazoo River bottomland, about a day's ride northwest of Vicksburg, owned by a family named Carrick. By the census year of 1860, the patriarch, Thomas Carrick, had brought the number of human beings he held in bondage to 163. Hester was 13 when she first appeared in the Carrick inventories as a field hand, priced at $400. She was 24 when those inventories stopped being kept in the summer of 1864. They stopped because by then Thomas Carrick himself had fled south to Alabama, with his 2 unmarried daughters, a wagon of silver, and the plantation Bible, leaving behind an overseer named Abner Gossett with full effective command of the property, and the 156 human beings still on it. Abner Gossett was the kind of man whose reputation does not survive in the polite histories written by his grandchildren, but does survive vividly and in terrible detail in the Works Progress Administration's slave narratives collected by the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s. 3 different former Carrick people, interviewed independently in 3 different states over 2 years, described Abner Gossett in nearly identical terms. He was a small man, no more than 5'6", tall, with thinning pale red hair, pale red eyelashes, skin that burned easily in the sun, and a habit of smiling, a quiet, almost patient smile, when he gave orders that would cause suffering. He kept a pack of 6 dogs, trained from puppies to catch runaways, and he had taught the lead dog to hold a grown man at the throat without closing its jaws. He kept a leather, handle-braided whip he had named, without any apparent sense of blasphemy, the preacher, and which he used with what one interviewed woman called terrible patient steadiness, as if reading a sermon out loud 1 verse at a time. He also kept his own ledger, separate from the plantation books, in which he recorded the punishments he had administered and the names of people who had been, in his own particular phrase, corrected. Hester's name appeared in that ledger more than any other. We know this not from the ledger itself, which was burned sometime in 1865, but from the testimony of a woman named Roa Green, Hester's half-sister by their shared mother. In the spring of 1937, at age 91, Green sat on the back porch of her granddaughter's house in Memphis, Tennessee, and talked for 4 hours into the microphone of a WPA interviewer named Lemuel Cross. The interviewer's typewritten transcript, now in the Library of Congress, runs to 47 pages. 41 of those pages are about Abner Gossett. The other 6 are about what Hester did on the night she left. It was the second week of September 1864. The cotton was in. The war was 16 months from its end, though no one on the Yazoo River knew that yet. That afternoon, Gossett had ordered 3 men flogged publicly in the yard for stealing corn from the corn crib. By nightfall, the 3 men were locked inside the crib itself, a stone-walled, windowless building with a single heavy door, no water, and no treatment of any kind for the wounds on their backs. One of the 3 was Hester's younger brother, a young man of about 19, whose given name in the plantation ledger is recorded only as Cass. According to Roa Green, the moon that night was near full, but heavy cloud cover was moving in from the southwest. Hester waited without speaking, without eating her supper, without lying down on her pallet, until the cloud bank finally crossed the face of the moon a little before 2 in the morning. Then she stood up. She took off her shoes, because they made a sound on the boards. She walked barefoot, carrying nothing in her hands, across the plantation yard, through the kitchen garden, and up to the side door of the main house, where Abner Gossett slept alone in a ground floor bedroom. His wife had left him 3 years earlier and gone back to her mother's people in Tennessee. She did not speak. She did not scream. According to Roa Green, she did not even breathe hard. What she did to Abner Gossett in the next several minutes, and with what instrument? The WPA interviewer, Lemuel Cross, declined to transcribe in full. The transcript at that exact point contains only a single notation in Cross's handwriting. Subject became distressed. Conversation paused 14 minutes. Then a single resumed sentence in Roa's own voicey. She left him where he could be found, but not where he could be helped. Hester then walked back across the yard to the corn crib, broke the iron hasp of the lock with the long iron bar Gossett himself had used that day to bar the door, carried her brother out on her back because he could no longer walk or stand, and laid him down gently under a peach tree on the edge of the yard, where a woman named Delia was already waiting in the dark with a stoneware jug of sweet water and a poultice of chewed tobacco leaves, and lard for the wounds on his back. Hester did not stay. She did not even kiss her brother goodbye. She took Gossett's revolver. She took Gossett's boots. She took Gossett's thoroughbred horse from the stable, and she rode north through the cane. By first light, she was in the Yazoo swamp. By the following night, she had reached the Union Army picket line outside Vicksburg, where a young corporal in the 47th Illinois Volunteer Infantry would later write to his wife that a colored woman on a fine thoroughbred horse had come walking out of the cane at dusk, a pistol stuck in her belt, with the calmest face he had ever seen in his life. The corporal wrote that the woman had said her name was Hester, that she was 24 years old, that she was not going back, and that she would not say goodbye to her brother, because she was afraid that if she did, she would not be able to leave. The corporal's letter, preserved today in the Illinois State Historical Library in Springfield, is the first document anywhere in the United States in which Hester appears as a free woman. It is also the last document anywhere in which she appears under that name. From the Vicksburg picket line, she moved north with the Union supply trains, working her passage in exchange for food and a place to sleep. By the winter of 1865, she had reached the river depot town of Cairo, Illinois, at the confluence of the Ohio and the Mississippi. There she found work as a laundress in a boarding house that catered to Union officers. And there, according to 2 separate references in the quartermaster records of the 13th Army Corps, held at the National Archives in Washington, she also served, unpaid, as a tracker and scout attached to a Union cavalry detachment under a captain named Winthrop Hayes. Captain Hayes was a Vermonter, a Dartmouth graduate, a man who kept a daily diary from the outbreak of the war until his death in 1888. His diaries were recovered in 1951 from his family estate outside Brattleboro and donated to the University of Vermont. 3 of those diary entries, and only 3, mentioned Hester. In the first, dated February 11, 1865, Hayes writes that the colored woman H brought in 2 deserters from the 27th Missouri before sundown, without assistance, without firing her weapon, and asked for no payment, only a pair of army issue boots in her own size, which I provided from the quartermaster's stock. In the second, dated March 3, 1865, he writes a single sentence. She can read sign the way a Methodist reads scripture. In the third and final entry, dated April 19, 1865, 5 days after Lincoln's assassination and 10 days after Lee's surrender, Hayes writes at length. He writes that H had come to him at dawn, already dressed for the road, her horse saddled outside the tent, and had asked to be formally released from whatever informal service she was still rendering the army. He asked where she intended to go. She told him, in words he quotes directly, that she was going to find the man Gossett, whom she had left at Carrick the September before, and who she had only learned the previous week from a freedman passing through Cairo had not in fact died of his wounds. He had been found by a Confederate field doctor on the road out of Vicksburg, nursed slowly back from the edge of death over the winter of 1864-65, and had since spring joined a Confederate guerrilla band operating in the borderland between southern Arkansas and the Indian Territory under a false name. Hayes wrote that he had tried for the better part of an hour to talk her out of it. He reminded her that the war was ending, the country exhausted, that a colored woman riding alone into that country would have no law to protect her, no friend to bury her, no witness to speak her name. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She listened until he was finished, thanked him for the boots and the use of his horse, and walked out of his tent into the cold gray light. He never saw her again. Which brings us, by the long way around, to the Indian Territory and to the 5 years of her life between the spring of 1869 and the autumn of 1874, about which we know all at once the most and the least, and by a considerable margin the most disturbing things. Between those 2 dates, a woman answering her description appeared and reappeared in the court records of the federal court at Fort Smith. Always at a distance. Never directly. She never testified in open court. She never signed her own name to any document. She never accepted payment in person from any federal officer. She collected her bounties entirely through an intermediary, a Choctaw freedman named Isham Folsom, who had fought in the Union Indian Home Guard during the war and by the late 1860s had settled on a small farm at Scullyville, earning a quiet supplementary income as her banker and go-between with the marshals. The court clerk's ledgers record that in those 5 years, bounty payments totaling $4,611.27 were paid out to Folsom on warrants that had been served by, in the clerk's consistent phrasing, across more than 30 separate entries, the colored female tracker known as Nani. That was an enormous sum of money in the currency of the period, roughly the lifetime earnings of a skilled tradesman. It represented the capture or killing of at least 31 federal fugitives. She operated alone, without a partner, without a pause, without any backup. She rode a succession of different horses, never keeping the same animal for longer than a season, because she knew a horse was the first thing an outlaw would recognize on a road. And she wore, according to the 3 surviving eyewitness accounts of her at work, a long man's wool coat dyed black, with walnut hulls to kill the shine, a wide, brimmed black felt hat pulled low against the sun, heavy broken-in boots, and around her neck under the coat, a thin leather cord from which hung 7 small, notched bone beads. No man or woman ever saw her, in any of the accounts we have, without that cord. The whispered rumor among the outlaws of the territory was that the beads were one for each of the 7 men she was still looking for. She did not take the men she was not looking for, and she turned them in alive when she could, which was significantly more often than the men of her trade. She accepted the lower bounty, rather than deliver a corpse. But when it came to one of the 7, she did not bring him in alive. She did not bring him in at all. When she found one of the 7, the body was never seen again. The horse would walk into a settlement days later. The cabin would be found undisturbed. The trail in the dirt would simply stop, and a single filed bone bead would be left somewhere at the scene, smooth and pale against the dark ground. The first of the 7 to be crossed off her list was a Missouri guerrilla named Jubal Creech, who had ridden with Quantrill's raiders during the war, had been at the Lawrence Massacre of 1863, according to 2 sworn depositions, and had afterward joined the same Arkansas Indian Territory brush band as Abner Gossett. In the summer of 1865, Creech was found, or rather, not found. In the spring of 1870, on the Pine Mountain Trail north of the Kiamichi River, his horse walked into a Choctaw settlement 3 days later. With saddlebags still tied on, rifle still in the scabbard, a full canteen at the pommel, and a single filed bone bead wedged carefully into the stitching of the saddle, where anyone who unsaddled the animal would find it. The Choctaw light horseman who examined the horse said the bead was a message, though they would not say to whom, or from whom, or what it meant. The second of the 7 was a Cherokee freedman turned horse thief named Weisban, who had joined Gossett's band in 1866 after the hanging of his own father for stealing a judge's mule, and who had developed a particular reputation for violence against women. Span disappeared in the winter of 1871 from a remote log cabin on the north branch of Black Fork Creek, between one evening and the following morning. His cabin, when deputy marshals reached it 4 days later, was undisturbed in every respect. His coffee pot still on the cold stove, his boots still standing side by the door, his pipe still lying on the table next to a dog-eared copy of the Tahlequah newspaper, and on the table, placed in the exact geometric center of a square of clean white paper, was a single filed bone bead. Beneath it, written in a careful schoolroom hand, that several readers have described as unusually beautiful, were the names of 3 women and 2 children. A missionary schoolteacher in Tahlequah later recognized the names. They corresponded exactly to 5 Carrick plantation people, 3 adult women and 2 young children, who had been sold away from the plantation in 1861, separated from their families and never heard from again, with Weisban himself listed in the surviving bill of sale as the buyer's agent who had arranged their transport south. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th of the 7 fell in quick succession across the summer and autumn of 1872, in circumstances that for reasons of length I will not detail here in full, except to note that in each case a filed bone bead was left where the body should have been. In each case, the man had named himself in some prior confession to a priest, friend, or drinking companion, as having been present at the Carrick plantation during a specific documented act of cruelty committed against Hester's mother, whose name in the Carrick inventory of 1854 was recorded as Temp. And in each case, the trail of the missing man, followed by deputy marshals sometimes for days, simply ended at a riverbank, sinkhole, or cotton field edge, as if the man had walked into the ground and the ground had politely closed over him. By early spring 1873, the 2 names remaining on Hester's bone cord were Abner Gossett himself, and a man about whom I have to warn you now, The surviving records are so fragmentary, so deliberately redacted, so carefully and institutionally broken, that we cannot even be entirely certain of his real name. The court clerk whose private letters to his wife first surfaced in the spring of 1962, when his grandson opened a locked trunk in an attic in Van Buren, refers to the seventh man in a letter written in the early summer of 1873 as simply, "the man we do not speak of." He notes in that same letter, with considerable unease, that the marshal's office in Fort Smith had received that June a direct instruction from Washington, delivered in person by a senior Interior Department official who had traveled down specifically for this purpose, not to issue any warrant under or any name for any fugitive associated with a certain federal property in Indian Territory. He does not name the property. He does not name the fugitive. He notes only that the instruction had troubled him greatly, that he had lost sleep over it for weeks, and that in his private view the instruction had come because someone in Washington, someone high enough to send an interior official on a special train across 3 states, was afraid of what a certain colored female tracker would find if she continued riding in the direction she was already in to be riding. The court clerk's name was Thaddeus Buell. He had been born in Vermont, educated at a small Presbyterian college in Ohio, and had come to Fort Smith as a young man after the war. His letters to his wife, who had remained in Ohio during his first 3 years because of her ill health, are the single most important primary source on the last phase of Hester's life. They are also the source that the Arkansas Historical Society, meeting on 2 separate occasions in the autumn of 1962, voted by majority not to publish. If you're finding this story as unsettling as I am, take a moment right now to hit the like button below. It genuinely helps these forgotten American stories reach people who would never otherwise hear them, and it tells me specifically to keep digging into the archives for more. If you already have a theory about who the seventh man was, or what the instruction from Washington was protecting, drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Now, let me tell you what happened next. Because this is where the story stops being a hunt and starts becoming something considerably darker, and where the records themselves begin to behave strangely, going missing, coming back, being replaced with other records that do not say the same thing. In the high summer of 1873, Hester went silent for 4 months. There are no payments to Isham Folsom in the Fort Smith ledger from the first week of June through the last week of September. No recorded sightings of her on the Choctaw roads. No reports of her passage at any of the Arkansas River ferries, where her passage had previously been tracked with some consistency by ferrymen who knew her coat and hat. No whispered rumors at trading posts in Mayville or Atoka or Eufaula. She simply disappeared for 4 consecutive months in the middle of her most active year. The silence ended on October 14, 1873, when a Creek Nation light horseman named Pleasant Porter, then 23 years old, later in 1899 the principal chief of the Creek Nation, rode into Fort Smith with a sealed dispatch for the federal marshal. The dispatch reported that a white man answering Abner Gossett's description, former overseer of the Carrick plantation in Mississippi, had been found 3 days earlier in an abandoned line shack on the North Fork of the Canadian River, about 40 miles west of Eufaula. He had been found alive. He had been found bound to a wooden chair with leather straps cut from a saddle. And he had been found with a square of paper pinned to the front of his shirt by a sewing needle, on which had been written, in the same careful schoolroom hand, only 3 words. Porter's dispatch, preserved in the Fort Smith Federal Archives, preserves those 3 words exactly as written. Not him alone. Beneath them was drawn in the same hand a small neat sketch of a bone bead, and the bone bead in the sketch had not been filed smooth. Abner Gossett was brought to Fort Smith under heavy guard, tried before Judge Isaac Parker in mid-November 1873 on 6 counts of murder committed during and after the war, convicted on 4 of them, sentenced to hang, and hanged on February 7, 1874, at 11 in the morning, on the great gallows in the courtyard of the federal jail before a crowd estimated by the Fort Smith newspaper at roughly 800 people who had come from the country specifically to see it. In his final statement from the scaffold, recorded by a reporter from the Fort Smith elevator and printed the following morning, Abner Gossett did not confess, did not beg, did not pray, did not ask forgiveness of any man or any God, he said. And the reporter's shorthand notes preserve this exactly. She should have killed me herself, and she will never forgive herself that she did not. And the man she is still looking for is a worse man than I ever was. And you will never hang him. And you will never even write his name down. Because the people who own him own you, too. Those were Abner Gossett's last words in this world. The hangman released the trapdoor. The crowd went home. The reporter filed his copy. And Hester, wherever she was that morning, began the final hunt of her life. The hunt that would consume the last 15 months of her work, take her across 3 states, and bring her at the end to something she had not expected to find, and that we ourselves, reading the records 150 years later, are forced to confront as the thing the Arkansas Historical Society could not bring itself to publish. The 7th name on Hester's cord, as it turns out, was not a name at all. It was a title, and the title, in the surviving margin notes of Thaddeus Bill to his own personal copies of the court ledger, was Indian Agent. Specifically, the federal Indian agent assigned to a particular agency within the Indian Territory between 1855 and 1861. A man whose official federal duties had included the distribution of annuity payments to one of the 5 tribes, the licensing of white traders doing business within that tribe's boundaries, and, most importantly for this story, the regulation of slavery within the agency's jurisdiction. This last duty existed because at that time the 5 tribes were themselves, in the eyes of federal law, sovereign slave-holding nations. The agent's role therefore included, among his other responsibilities, the official return of runaway slaves who had crossed into the territory from the United States to their legal owners in the states east of the Arkansas River. The agency in question was a real place, with real buildings, real employees, real account books. It still exists today as an archaeological site on federal land. Though the original buildings are long gone, only the foundations and a single restored outbuilding remain. The agent in question was also a real man. His name is known to researchers. It appears in the Interior Department appointment rolls for 1855 and in the department's termination rolls for 1861, when he resigned for reasons described at the time as personal. I have chosen, after consulting with a living descendant of one of the families involved, not to put his full name into this video, because there are still people alive today who bear his name and his blood, and who have had no part whatsoever in the things I am about to describe. What matters for the story is not his name. What matters is what he had done. According to the reconstruction assembled in the autumn of 1962 by an amateur historian named Silas Fry, a retired schoolteacher from Fort Smith, who had spent the better part of 3 years reading Thaddeus Bill's letters and cross-referential records and plantation purchase ledgers. The agent had run a private business on the side of his federal position between 1860 when he president. He had used his official federal powers to identify runaway slaves from the southern states, who had managed to reach the Indian Territory. He had captured those runaways with the help of a small standing group of 4 or 5 hired men inside the boundaries of his own agency, and he had then sold those runaways, not back to their original owners, which would have required paperwork and would have been noticed, but to entirely new slaveholders in Texas and Arkansas, at a substantial personal profit, pocketed directly and recorded in no official ledger. The business was illegal under both federal and tribal law. It was also, because of the geography of the territory in that period and the almost complete absence of federal oversight of agency activity, effectively invisible to anyone outside the 4 or 5 men personally involved in its operation. Working slowly through 13 boxes of agency records that had been transferred to the National Archives in 1861 and never examined by any historian in the intervening century, identified by name at least 34 separate individuals who had been taken through the agent's private pipeline in those 6 years. 29 of the 34 names were fully recoverable. One of the 29 names on a bill of sale dated November 17, 1854, was Temp. That was the same Temp who appeared in the Carrick Plantation inventory of January 1855 as a recent purchase from an Indian agency in the Creek Nation for $450. Listed by her age, her approximate height, and the birthmark on her left shoulder. That was the same Temp who had given birth 9 months later to a girl named Hester. That was the same Temp who had died at Carrick in the late spring of 1858, under circumstances the plantation recorded officially as fever, but that the WPA narratives collected 79 years later from 3 separate witnesses describe in terms no serious historian has ever treated as fever. Hester had not known. This is the piece of the story that strikes hardest, and it is the piece hardest to write about calmly. The records we have, fragmentary as they are, strongly suggest that Hester had believed, throughout her entire life, from her earliest childhood memory on the plantation until the late summer of 1873, when she was already 33 years old, that her mother had been born at Carrick, had lived her whole life at Carrick, had died at Carrick, and had never seen any other piece of ground in the world. What Hester learned in the late summer of 1873, and what caused her to go silent for those 4 unaccounted months, was that her mother had once, for a very brief period, been free. Her mother had been born into slavery on a cotton plantation in Monroe County, Alabama in 1834. She had escaped from that plantation at age 19 in the early spring of 1853, walking west for 41 nights across Mississippi and Louisiana and the eastern edge of Texas. She had made it to the Creek Nation in the late summer of that same year. She had been alive, free, and safe in the Indian Territory for 10 full months, and then, in the early autumn of 1854, a federal Indian agent had hunted her down inside a Creek freedman's cabin, where she had been taking shelter, had put her in a wagon at gunpoint, with 3 other captured runaways, had driven the wagon 180 miles to a plantation landing on the Yazoo River, and had sold her to Thomas Carrick for $450 in gold coin. 9 months later, she gave birth at Carrick to a daughter she named Hester, which in some old traditions is a name given to children who are hoped for and waited for, and carried a long way before they arrive. 4 years after that, in the spring of 1858, she was dead. The man who had sold her was, in the late summer of 1873, still alive. He was living comfortably on a federal pension under his own name in a small town in eastern Arkansas, under the explicit protection of the instruction from Washington that Thaddeus Buell had noted with such unease. And Hester, in the late summer of 1873, having at last learned his name from sources the records do not preserve, rode east out of the Indian Territory toward that small town in Arkansas to find him. She found him in December. We know this because Dr. Josiah Alden, a physician in Fort Smith whose professional casebook, bound in black cloth, surviving in the special collections of the University of Arkansas Library, recorded on December 17 that he had been summoned at 2 in the afternoon to a boarding house on the Van Buren Road, about 6 miles from the edge of town. He attended a white man suffering from what the doctor described as a gunshot wound of the lower abdomen, inflicted at very close range with a large caliber weapon consistent, in the doctor's professional opinion, with a Remington Army revolver fired at a distance of less than 6 feet. The doctor also described a second wound on the same patient, which he declined to describe in any detail, writing only that it was a ritual mutilation of a character so distressing and so deliberate in its execution that I would not commit it to writing in any casebook that might by any chance be read by another physician or by a family member of the deceased at a later date. The man died on December 19, 1874, at approximately 4 in the morning, after 2 days of what the doctor recorded as the most protracted and most horrible suffering he had ever, in 28 years of frontier practice, witnessed in a dying human being. The doctor's casebook, throughout the entire entry, does not record the man's name, because, as the doctor notes at the end of the entry in a line, apparently added later, a sheriff's deputy, who had arrived at the boarding house late on December 18, had instructed him directly not to record the name under any circumstances, and had later returned in the hour after the death to take official possession of the body. The boarding house register for that week, recovered in the 1940s from the attic of a building being demolished for a gas station, contained for the relevant dates no entry of any kind for the room the doctor had described. The page had been torn out clean along the binding. What the doctor did record, in a margin note on the same page of his casebook, that seems from the different ink color and slight handwriting change to have been written some weeks later, and then never edited out, was this on the small pine table beside the dying man's bed on the second morning. While the man was still barely conscious, the doctor had seen a single small filed bone bead, smooth as river, washed ivory, and beside the bone bead a small square of clean white paper, and on the square of paper, written in a careful schoolroom hand, the single word, temp. Just that one word, nothing else. And Dr. Josiah Alden had known, without being told, in a way he could not later explain to himself, that he was looking at the end of something that had started a long time before he arrived at that boarding house. Something that had traveled a great distance and had, on this cold December morning, in a rented room in eastern Arkansas, at last come home. He did not know the beginning. We do. Hester was not arrested. No warrant was ever sworn by any sheriff, marshal, or federal officer of any description for the death of the man on the Van Buren Road. Because officially, the man on the Van Buren Road had not died. Officially, he had not been there. Officially, according to the Washington instruction, he had not existed in the Indian Territory or the state of Arkansas in any capacity since his resignation in 1861. The instruction had done its work. His pension continued to be paid out for another 16 years to a post office box in a different town, in a different state, apparently collected by someone. But Hester did not go back to the Indian Territory. She did not return to Isham, Folsom on his small farm at Scullyville. She did not collect another bounty from the Fort Smith court. She did not, as far as any surviving record anywhere indicates, ever fire any weapon at any person for any reason for the remainder of her life. What she did do, according to the last document that mentions her by any name, was buy a piece of land. The land was 80 acres of cut-over timber country, in a shallow valley in the hill country of western Arkansas, about 30 miles northwest of Fort Smith and 12 miles from the nearest town. The deed was recorded in the county deed book on March 11, 1875, under the name Hester Alden, the surname apparently borrowed, with permission, from the doctor who had treated her mother's killer, and who seems, from a single surviving letter in the Alden family papers, to have become in the last weeks of 1874 and first weeks of 1875 her unlikely friend. She paid $160 cash for the 80 acres. She built, with her own hands and the occasional help of 2 black carpenters from the nearest town, a small 2-room frame house with a stone chimney and a good well. She planted an orchard of Arkansas's black apple trees. She kept bees, 9 hives by 1878, and sold the honey in jars at the Saturday market in the nearest town. She is recorded in the 1880 federal census of that county as a widow, black, approximately 40, occupation farmer, living alone, unable to read or write, which was not true, but was what she told the census taker. After the 1880 census, the trail goes cold. There is no death record for Hester Alden in the county register. No grave marker in any cemetery in that county bearing that name. No will on file at the courthouse. The 80 acres, the frame house, and the apple orchard passed at some point before 1900 into the hands of a small black Methodist church in the county, which held the land in trust as a burial ground for black Civil War veterans and their families, and which still stands on the property today as a small congregation of about 60 members. The original orchard still bearing fruit each autumn. Whether Hester was buried in the orchard herself, under some other name or no name at all, or whether she simply walked one morning out of the frame house and into the woods and kept walking, we do not know. We may never know. The cotton sack rifle, the Sharps carbine the farmer plowed up in the Dry Creek bed in the fall of 1878, has been identified conclusively by 3 independent firearms historians working over 4 decades as the specific weapon issued from the Union Cavalry Quartermaster's stock at Cairo, Illinois, in the winter of 1865 to a Union cavalry scout attached to Captain Winthrop Hayes' detachment. The serial number on the receiver matches the quartermaster's ledger. The 11 names stitched into the inner seam of the cotton sack have been matched by painstaking archival comparison to known fugitives of the Indian Territory between 1869 and 1874. In 9 of the 11 cases, the name corresponds exactly to a man known to have been killed or captured by the tracker Nani in those years. In the 10th case, the name corresponds to the man on the Van Buren Road in December 1874. In the 11th case, the name corresponds to no fugitive, no soldier, no agent, no person of any description who has ever been successfully identified by any researcher in the 148 years since the rifle was plowed up. The stitching around the 11th name is noticeably different from the stitching around the other 10. It is tighter, more recent, done in a slightly different shade of thread. Some researchers, working with what little they have, argue that the 11th name was added to the sack after March 1875, perhaps years after, and represents a person Hester was still looking for at the very end of her life, a person she never found, whose identity died with her somewhere in the hill country of western Arkansas. Other researchers have argued something else entirely. They argue that the 11th name on the cotton sack is a name Hester gave herself. They argue it is the name of the woman she had become by the end, the woman she had been forced to become, in order to do what the law and the government of the United States had refused to do. On this reading, Hester added her own name last, not because she intended to kill herself, but because she understood at some level she could not speak aloud, that she had been hunting one more person the entire time, and that the person was herself. Which reading is correct, we do not know. We will never know. The rifle itself, After its removal from the farmer's hands on the second day, it reached the marshal's office in 1878, passed through a succession of federal offices over the following 13 years, was cataloged at the National Archives in Washington in the summer of 1891, stored in a locked evidence room in a basement in that building, and marked for official disposal in the spring of 1924. What happened to it after the disposal order? No one can say. It does not appear in any subsequent federal inventory, public or private. Just when we thought we had reached the end, the horror of the story deepens in one final unexpected direction. And the direction is not the one you are expecting. If this story has stayed with you up to this point, take a moment now to share it with a friend who loves forgotten American history. Hit the like button to help the algorithm find others who need to hear it. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Then let's look together at the one final detail, the single small detail that made the Arkansas Historical Society close the file in 1962 and leave it closed for the last 64 years. The detail the society could not publish was not about Hester. It was about the agent, Silas Fry, the amateur historian who had assembled the dossier in the autumn of 1962 out of Thaddeus Boole's letters, the agency records, and the scattered testimony, had in the course of his research tracked down, through the slow work of genealogy and county probate records, a living descendant of the agent's family. She was a woman in her late 60s, the agent's great-granddaughter, a retired schoolteacher like Fry himself, living alone in a small white frame house in a small town in southern Arkansas. Fry had written to her, explained the nature of his research in general terms without revealing the worst of what he had found, and asked whether any family papers survived from her great-grandfather's time in federal service. She wrote back within a week. There was a trunk in the attic. It had been in the family since the agent's death in 1893. No one had ever opened it, so far as she knew. She invited Fry to come and help her open it. Fry drove down on a Tuesday in October 1962. He spent the better part of Wednesday afternoon with the elderly great-granddaughter on the floor of her small, overheated attic, going through the contents of the trunk piece by piece. Most of what they found was expected. Family photographs, daguerreotypes and tintypes of men and women in high collars, some named on the back in pencil, some not. Property deeds bundled with ribbon, personal letters tied up in packets, a family Bible with births and deaths, recorded in 2 different handwritings. And at the very bottom of the trunk, wrapped in a yellowed pillowcase, folded 4 times, was a single small cloth bag about the size of a man's fist, stitched shut at the top with neat black thread. The elderly woman said that her mother, who had died in 1941, had once told her when she was a girl of about 9 never to open that bag, without ever explaining why. Fry asked permission to open it. She hesitated. She asked if he thought it mattered. He said he thought it mattered very much. She gave her permission. Fry cut the stitches carefully with a small pair of sewing scissors her mother had left her. He opened the bag. Inside, separated by small squares of yellowed tissue paper so they would not tangle with one another, were 14 locks of human hair. Each lock was tied at one end with a different colored silk ribbon, red, blue, green, black, and others. Each lock was pinned to its square of tissue paper with a small brass pin, and each square was labeled in brown ink, in the agent's own handwriting, with a first name and a date. The earliest date was April 9, 1855. The latest was August 22, 1861. 14 names, 14 dates, 14 locks of hair. He had kept them for 32 years, from the end of his federal service until his death in 1893. Hidden from his wife, hidden from his children, hidden from every other human being who ever lived in that house. The 13th name on the list, tied with a black ribbon, written on tissue paper, dated November 17, 1854, 2 months before the sale of her to Thomas Carrick on the Yazoo River, was Temp. The elderly great-granddaughter, the retired schoolteacher, had not known. She had not known any of it. She had not known that her great-grandfather had trafficked in human beings. She had not known what the small cloth bag her mother had told her never to open contained. She had not known the names. She had not known the dates. She had not known that the same federal pension she had grown up hearing mentioned with pride at Sunday dinners had been the pension of a man who sold children for gold. She sat on the floor of the attic for several minutes without speaking. Then she asked Silas Fry if she could be alone for a few hours. He said, "Of course." He went downstairs and sat on her front porch in the October sun. When he came back up to the attic 3 hours later, the small cloth bag was empty. The 14 locks of hair were gone. The tissue paper was gone. The ribbons were gone. She had, she said, given them back. She had taken them in a clean cotton handkerchief, folded 4 times, to a cemetery she happened to know about. A small black Methodist cemetery in a shallow valley in western Arkansas, with old apple trees growing along its eastern edge, which she had read about in a county history pamphlet some years earlier. She had gone to the cemetery alone late in the morning with a garden trowel in her purse. She had asked the groundskeeper for permission to bury something small, and she had not told him what it was. In the corner of the cemetery nearest the apple trees, she had buried the 14 locks of hair under 14 small flat stones she had gathered from the creek bed on her way in, and she had asked to be forgiven, in the name of a great-grandfather she had never met, and a woman whose name she had only learned that same afternoon. Silas Fry wrote all of this down. He wrote it that same night in his small hotel room, in the longhand he used for his research notes. It is in the papers he left behind when he died in 1978. The papers the Arkansas Historical Society voted twice in 2 separate, closed meetings not to publish. That is the reason they voted not to publish. They did not feel it was their place to decide whether Hester had forgiven the agent or not. They did not feel they had the moral authority as an institution to assert that the matter was closed, or that the matter was open, or that the matter had any conclusion at all beyond the one a private woman in a private moment, in a cemetery she barely knew, had attempted to grant on behalf of another woman she had never met. And so they closed the file, and the file remains closed. That is where the story sits today, in a locked cabinet in Little Rock, in the sealed dossier of an amateur historian who died in a nursing home in 1978, whose children never read his papers, in the margin notes of a federal court clerk who wrote to his wife in Ohio about a woman he had never personally met, but whose passage through his ledgers had changed over 5 years the shape of his moral universe. The records do not tell us, and probably never will, whether Hester herself ever knew about the locks of hair. They do not tell us whether she knew at the end of her life, in the frame house in the valley of the apple trees, that her mother had been kept by her killer in the form of a ribboned relic for 20 years after her death. They do not tell us whether, on some cold night in the winter of 1890 or 1891 or 1892, Hester sat on the porch of that small frame house and understood at last that the thing she had been hunting for 25 years had not in fact been men, had not been a list of names stitched in rust-colored thread on the inner seam of a cotton sack, had been a single unbearable fact about the country she was born into and the century she was made to live through, and that her hunt had ended not because the names were all crossed off, but because the hunter had finally understood what it was she had been hunting. We do not know. We cannot know. We can only guess. And the guess, when we allow ourselves to make it, carries the weight of every person whose name never made it into a ledger, whose hair was never kept, whose child never learned that her mother had once, for 10 short months, in a Creek freedman's cabin in the autumn of 1853, been free. This story shows us something about the country we live in that our official histories do not like to tell us plainly. It shows us that justice, when denied by the law and the government, is sometimes taken up in secret by the very people the law and the government have chosen to abandon. And that when it is taken up that way, it cannot be called justice in any clean sense. But it cannot be called anything else either. It shows us that the line between hunter and hunted is not always a moral one, and that sometimes the only people who can cross that line with any clarity are those who have already been across it once before in the other direction. It shows us that a woman who had been written down in a plantation inventory in 1860 as 400 of property could then a single decade make the most feared white outlaws on the American frontier bury their weapons in the dirt and run for the Mexican border at the sound of a name. And it shows us, perhaps above all, that when we are told the records have been lost, or the story cannot be confirmed, or the file has been closed for reasons of historical delicacy, we should always ask who had the power to decide what was recorded and what was lost, and who has benefited in the years since from the forgetting. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Hester was a murderer, a soldier, a judge, a prophet, or something for which our language does not yet have a clean word? Do you believe the Arkansas Historical Society was right to keep the file closed? Or should the agent's name be published at last 150 years later, so the ledger is finally balanced? Leave your comment below. I read every single one, and I argue with some of them. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who believes the dead still have claims on us. I will see you in the next one.